I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Elena Botelho, is co-author of the international bestseller, The CEO Next Door, The 4 Behaviors That Transform Ordinary People into World-Class Leaders. Drawing on in-depth analysis of 2,600 leaders drawn from a database of 17,000 CEOs, as well as 13,000 hours of interviews, The CEO Next Door is crammed full of myth-busting and counterintuitive insights into what it really takes to be a top CEO. Elena, a huge welcome and thank you for being here.
Oliver, thank you for having me. I really look forward to the conversation.
You've studied and advised on hundreds of CEO successions. What are the archetypal mistakes boards make that a listener sitting on a nominations committee next month might learn from?
The first thing that I would say is when we look at successions that have gone well, we will rarely look at it and say, oh, the process was fabulous. What we'll usually say is the board did a great job picking the right person. So the focus is all on the person. When we tease apart successions gone wrong, which unfortunately there are too many of those still to this day with some of the best companies, inevitably it's the process that has gone wrong. And it's usually insidious process oversight or the boards being overly comfortable and assuming they have a robust process where they don't. And what's really unfortunate about that is that often those are unforced errors. So those are often mistakes that are actually, when tackled at the right time, could have been prevented, and billions of dollars of shareholder value get lost. So there's some research showing that over $112 billion of shareholder value is eroded annually because boards pick the wrong CEOs. And so it's often process missteps that lead to the wrong answer and the wrong outcome at the end. And the unfortunate thing is the delicate kind of nature of the succession process is that there's certain things that you can only do right at the right time. And once the train has left the station on certain things, it becomes really difficult to recover. And so I guess the one thing, very simple takeaway for any nominating committee member is that if you think you have a bulletproof process, the data shows that's unlikely. And you should always be asking yourself, have we taken enough of an outside point of view? Have we really challenged ourselves to ask ourselves, have we done everything possible at any stage in the process to make sure that number one, it's objective, number two, it's timely, that we're doing the right things at the right time, and that we're really using the power of the full board and this partnership with the CEO in the right way to lead to a great outcome at the end. And I'm happy, of course, we can elaborate on lots of these pieces, but that I always find really unfortunate because there's certain things that we can't control in life, right? But process a board should be able to control, but yet too many of them settle for something that feels good and feels comfortable, but is woefully insufficient.
What do you mean by take with an outside view?
Yeah, I mean, look, nobody should be doing surgery on themselves, right? Motherhood and apple pie for any board member. If you ask them, what's your number one job? Our number one job is to secure the right person in the CEO role, empower them, challenge them, and hold them accountable. And yet most boards, when it comes to actually executing on that duty of having the kind of robust CEO succession plan, come up short. One thing that I often see that we often will talk to our clients about is familiarity is not data, right? And so the unfortunate thing is the same board, and I've been in the boardrooms where it was fascinating. So I sat through a day of board meetings, and we have a presentation on a new technology system that's about an hour long. You have Accenture and IBM presenting, and you have the leadership team with lots of the analytics coming to the table. Then we're talking about opening an office in India. Similarly, there are outside parties that come in with an objective perspective. There's detailed analytics. And then time comes for succession. And in this particular case, the board asked me to just come and sit in and help them think about where they could dial up their process. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in the world of qualitative dialogue, informal opinions. Everyone has a point of view. And that's the danger, right? When it comes to leadership, every board member thinks they know what good leadership looks like. And as a result, they miss an opportunity to actually apply at least the same level of discipline as they do to all the other kind of business that they dispatch as a board to what they will say is their number one task and number one responsibility as a board. And so what objective perspective looks like is getting the best quality outside support to help the board set up the process that's really effective and also provide an independent point of view on the options around succession as well.
One of the new offerings we've launched is this concept of a pop-up board, where as a CEO, you can assemble a group of what one participant described as the Avengers, and you can get them to really understand the challenge you're facing and then share their experience and wisdom, and they are tailored as a group to your specific problem and situation. And hearing you talk there makes me think, gosh, actually, that'd be quite an interesting exercise to apply to your CEO hire. If you as a board have chosen someone, you could bring in that group to interrogate your assumptions in the same way that you could as an investment committee before making an investment, of people who are entirely emotionally detached from the process, coming at it cold. And I suppose the question is, would you apply that to the CEO, get them to meet the CEO directly, or would you get them to look at your notes on why you're appointing the CEO and to interrogate you as a board on why you're appointing them?
Well, first of all, I love the idea of a pop-up board. I've never heard about it before. And, a separate conversation, would love to learn more about it. I mean, look, essentially we play the role. So ghSMART typically gets called in by boards to kind of play a role of that pop-up board. What makes us actually more effective is that we don't have a governance role, right? And in this case, our only mission is really to ensure that collectively both the CEO and the board arrive at a great outcome for the organization. There's a lot of power in actually not being part of the governance process and coming in as just a pure outside expert in a role that's partly facilitative, partly providing expertise and external data. And that could be a really important catalyst to, number one, make sure that the right conversations happen at the right time. Every board member that I've spoken with will privately say that they're not comfortable raising the topic of CEO succession with a successful CEO. And I know you've seen our piece in Harvard Business Review that talks about how what we find in our research is that CEO succession in iconic companies. So the more successful a company, the more successful a sitting CEO, the more challenging it is to actually lead and run an effective process for the board. And that's why often you see examples like Disney, most recently, you see Starbucks, you see a lot of these kind of iconic companies really faltering when it comes to CEO succession. And part of the reason starts with the fact that none of the board members feel comfortable asking the obvious questions to the CEO, or when they do, the conversation is really uncomfortable. There's kind of our point of view is that depending on how far out you are from the succession event, the role of the CEO and the board really needs to evolve and change. And so in the old days, we would often get called in, like in the 12 months leading up to the decision. And really the challenge was, can you please help us make sure, look at these candidates that we've identified, help us make sure we pick the right one. Today, we get called 5 years before the likely transition point, or sometimes really early. We have CEOs calling us in the first year of their tenure as a sitting CEO saying, I got the role and I know I don't have a bench. And when my time comes to pass the reins, I need to know that we've done everything right. And so starting with a longer time horizon gives you a lot more degrees of freedom. But with a longer time horizon, it really is up to the CEO to set the stage for the process. And so we will often start the work very early on. Again, 5 years is not too early, actually, because if you think about it, 5 years is really just a couple of job rotations if you're hoping to pass the reins to an internal. And so obviously the longer time horizon you have, the more uncertainty you have, but also more degrees of freedom you have to really shape the bench for the role. So those are just a couple of thoughts. I think whether you do it with a pop-up board per se, or you use someone like ghSMART as a pop-up board effectively, having that independent party that's really coming in with a specific purpose of support around CEO succession, I've seen be really helpful to the board and to the CEO to surface the right questions, to make it really non-controversial and objective, and bring a really robust analytical view on talent, as opposed to kind of lots of opinions and art critic point of views.
Do you think there's a case for having that independent challenge just based on the facts presented by the board, or is there something actually real? There's real value, I assume, in your perspective, from that independent voice meeting the CEO for themselves?
Do you mean the incumbent or the potential candidates?
The potential candidates.
The potential candidates. Well, so in our case, absolutely, nobody should be opining on the succession options without actually having met the candidates. And so in our case, part of the work we do is an incredibly robust assessment of the candidates. I'll leave you with an astounding data point. Actually, often when we come in, most of our clients are incredibly sophisticated, and most of them have had their own succession processes. Usually by the time we arrive, they feel that they've done a lot of things right. And they bring us in to make sure, because of how important the succession is, to make sure that they've really kind of tested every possibility, right? We come in, we looked at them, and sometimes, quite often, I would say, a well-developed business, when we come in, they'll be kind of an heir apparent. Right. So there'll be someone, there's typically a slate of candidates, could be anywhere between 2 to 4. Sometimes it could be greater. And usually there's a little bit of this wink, wink, nod of, here are our candidates, but, we really think John over there is probably our best option. Right. So what we did is we analyzed successions we supported, and we looked at the initial quote unquote heir apparent. And then after we've done all the work, we've completed our analysis, we've completed our assessments, who actually surfaces as the best fit candidate. And what do you think was the likelihood of the heir apparent being that best fit candidate? It was 47%. So it was worse than a coin toss. 53% of the time, in a situation where there's an institutional process, there's already work put into succession. When you bring in this outside kind of best in class support, and we do all the objective analysis, so 53% of the time, somebody else emerges as actually a better fit candidate. And so what that means is it's a pretty scary state of affairs, because that means that absent that external challenge, you're kind of in a position worse than a coin toss, right? And I can't imagine any board, whether it's a startup or FTSE 100 or Global 100, tolerating 50-50 on any business process. Right? You wouldn't tolerate that in your, plumbing, right? But you tolerate that in your CEO selection. And that's really, that's a threat to our well-being and success of the companies that we all depend on, right?
It's interesting. I think we see a similar phenomenon with non-executive appointments. Often there'll be someone that the board have in mind, and invariably when they actually compare them to a slate, when they've cast the net wide, it's very rare they end up actually appointing that person. I want to talk more about those typical mistakes boards make. And you, in the book, talk about people over-indexing on previous CEO experience, that actually that doesn't count for much. Over-indexing on charisma and confidence, and actually that doesn't count for much. But also, interestingly, past mistakes. And I feel like in recent years, we've seen a number of CEOs who've made mistakes, who have then been cast out. Really interested to hear how you would advise a board member on a nominations committee looking at someone with a past mistake as a CEO on their CV.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so first, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how we approach assessment works to give you context of kind of how we come into it. So the very first thing is the CEO you choose needs to fit in the private equity talk, value creation plan we have, right? One thing we found in our research, there's no such thing as kind of a universal athlete as a CEO, right? And you've seen CEOs and this myth of somebody that has a Midas touch, they can go into any company you've seen that be overturned, right? Where somebody has a tremendously successful tenure and then goes off and blows up in their next role. And our perspective is that they were not, we use the term scorecard, right? They were not fit to the scorecard. They might have been terrific in company one, and then they blew up because they weren't a fit. And so the very first thing we do is spend a lot of time with the CEO, with the current sitting CEO, and with each board member to talk about what's the vision of success? What will success look like? Is this going to be all about product transformation? Is this going to be all about efficiencies? Is this a roll-up? And what does the business need? And how does it need to be done? So what kind of leadership is needed to do it in the right way in the context of the company's culture, right? And so that's really always step one. And then we spend countless hours. We spend about half a day with each CEO candidate to analyze their pattern of past mistakes, their wins, their successes that they've had in their prior careers, understand the people that have been around them so that we understand not only the results they've produced, but importantly, how they produce those results. We gather 360 and reference data. We conduct often psychometric tests. And then based on all of these multi-rater, multi-method assessment tools, we come back to the board and we're able to present a really deep, multi-dimensional point of view. And most importantly, also help them look at the past track record and begin to extrapolate how it may or may not translate into the future, right? Very few boards would take the risk of hiring someone who's never made any mistakes, because essentially that person is not tested by fire. And in this day and age, right, one thing we can be certain is that they will be changed, there will be challenges. And so the boards do want to see somebody who's been tested through really difficult situations. They also want to see somebody who can be accountable, somebody who can own their mistakes. On the flip side, how do you know if a mistake is something that's a disqualifier or if it's actually a rite of passage, right? And that's a big question. We look at a couple of things. Number one, we look at how pervasive is that mistake over the course of someone's career. So the power of the time we spend with the individual is that we are able to present their track record, not just based on isolated examples that they chose to cherry pick, but we're able to see their entire longitude of their career and be able to tell you, well, you know, they blew up in this case because they mismanaged their stakeholders. They had a terrific strategy and they completely mismanaged their stakeholders. So what you need to be prepared for is that when they come in, they're going to bring a terrific strategy and they're going to mismanage the stakeholders. And so let's weigh the odds, because the other thing I'll tell you, and of course, Oliver, you know that from your own experience in the boardroom, perfect CEO candidate does not exist, right? Just like a perfect spouse doesn't exist, a perfect CEO candidate does not exist. And so what our process allows the board to do through the scorecard is we turn the decision from something that's very kind of gut feel focused to a set of decision criteria that are really clear, and now gives the board the power and the data to make rational, logical trade-offs, as opposed to kind of follow their sense of kind of who they liked, quote unquote. And so the other piece with mistakes that we always pay attention to, every client we have will usually do their own interview and come to us and say, Elena, when you guys do the assessment, you're going to find out he blew up here, but we talked about it and he learned and it was a great learning experience. The only way you get to know if somebody learned is if in the next 2 jobs, they no longer made that mistake. Every single person we've ever assessed, so we've assessed 26,000 executives as a firm. Every single person we ever assessed will tell us, oh, I made this mistake in this job and I learned from it. And 90% of the people continue to make that same mistake for the rest of their career, right? And so what's really important as a board is to peel apart what's the nature of the mistake, how relevant is it to what they'll have to do here, how recent is it? And then most importantly, the only way you get to conclude that they've actually learned from it is if you later see them do that well. And so that same executive that blew up with stakeholders, then in the next role was able to be really thoughtful about change management, was really able to engage in the right way and navigated something that was really complex really well. Well, now we can all claim victory and say, well, isn't that great? Now this is a rite of passage as a mistake, not a disqualifier, right? So those are just a couple of examples of how we would look at it when thinking about past mistakes.
You say the only way is to know if they've learned from it is to see whether or not it occurs again in the next 2 roles.
Actions speak louder than words in the boardroom and in life in general.
Where have you seen a board go most wrong on a CEO hire, where they were an experienced board and it was unexpected? And what did you learn from that experience that a board member listening might take something from?
I mean, look, generally speaking, this is kind of a very common path to a disappointing CEO succession, right? And that path usually starts with a very respected, very successful incumbent. And it starts with an incumbent that walks on water. And you can think of lots of companies out there right now that have those incumbents who've been in role for over 10 years. And they literally hung the moon. They've taken the company through financial crisis, or they've taken the company through COVID, and they've taken it through the highs and lows. And every time they've really succeeded, right? And a board of a company like that is going to be very deferential to that CEO. And then that CEO will come to the table. And I was listening to a presentation by a very well-known CEO who'll go unnamed, who got questioned about his CEO succession. And he said, as soon as my team is ready, I will move to the side. I'm not going to wait a minute longer. Guess what? CEOs like that never have a team that's ready, right? Because they never have a board that's ready to challenge them. And they never have a board that will say, well, we would love for you to be around for as long as you possibly can be. And yet it's our job to secure your legacy and secure a lasting success of this business for the shareholders and frankly for you, right? Because very few companies and very few CEOs want to go through the boomerang experience, right? And then those boards don't ask questions early. They don't launch a process that has any muscle behind it. They tiptoe around the CEO very uncomfortably. And then largely they will kind of have a check the box process. They'll have a few conversations and then they'll follow the lead of the CEO. And the CEO will pick their anointed successor and put them in a role. And then all of a sudden it so happens that even despite the fact that the CEO has known this individual for 20 years in their entire career, turns out they're not ready. Turns out now that they're in the CEO role, you have all sorts of surprises with their ethical behavior or with their ability to set strategy. If you talk to the team, all of that was knowable. There were people in the organization that if asked in the right way at the right time, the data was there. Those facts could have been known, the assessments could have been made, and they weren't, right? And again, I would just remind every board member is that familiarity is not data. You cannot be making the biggest decision as a board based on familiarity. What you need is real data.
So that fascinates me because I guess typically on these boards, you've got very experienced, very seasoned people. And I guess they're going through, when you talk about that familiarity, it's the sort of the boiled frog syndrome. They don't realize that they've become enthralled to it. I suppose one thing you can do, as you alluded to earlier, is bring in outside perspective. Is there anything else that you can do as an individual board member practically to overcome that deference that you've seen?
I think that dynamic is really hard to overcome on the board. I think all you could do is you can keep asking questions in different forums. You can ask questions to the CEO. You can try to, get to know the leaders. But it's very difficult as a board member because everybody, it's interesting. So in my day job, I'm an advisor. I've also sat on boards. And it's a lot easier to get a full view on an individual as an advisor because you're non-threatening, right? As a board member, most board members are multiple boards. You're coming in for kind of a defined period of time. And you get you get very curated view on the individuals. So what the board should do is, with or without outside support, they do need to kind of hold themselves to, okay, what do we value? What are we going to evaluate the candidates on? So at a minimum, having a scorecard. And then gathering that data and doing that in a disciplined fashion for different kinds of interactions from different board members, bringing different perspectives to the table. I find that many boards will have kind of the quieter board members or board members that might have contrarian points of view. And I think just creating structures where those points of view could be heard, I think will also increase the chances of a better process and a better outcome. But look, I mean, I think, fundamentally human nature is we avoid risk. We like to believe that the great show is just going to keep on going. And a lot of board members don't like to rock the boat, right? Ultimately, I think the board member that is in the best position to lead is normally the lead director, right? Or a chair, if it's an independent chair. But really any board member that has real trust of the CEO, right? Because I would also say on the flip side, as much as we talk about how important it is for the board to take an active stance, It's also critical for the CEO to be really engaged in the process because they truly do have the on the ground knowledge. But the magic happens when you bring the two together in a dialogue that's robust and open. That's kind of where you get to the best decision, right? Because I'll tell you also at the same time, for every board that's afraid to put the succession topic on the table, there's CEOs that lose sleep because we get, a lot of times we actually get called in by the CEO who will say, look, John, Peter, Sally, one day I think it's John. Meanwhile, the board wants to know the answer. And, look, John was fantastic, but now he's telling me maybe he doesn't want the job. And so the CEOs lose sleep over it because a lot of the CEOs, they want to do a good job and good conscience. But again, it's very difficult to do surgery on yourself.
So we've talked about what boards get wrong on CEO succession, and you talked about the lack of process, the lack of timeliness, and the lack of outside perspective as being hallmarks of those that typically go wrong. You also identified in your book some of the hidden patterns of CEO success. Talk me through your framework of what a board member listening to this should be looking for
Absolutely.
in a CEO that is predictive of success.
When we started the CEO genome research, we frankly didn't know if we would be able to uncover these kind of evergreen CEO success behaviors. We didn't know if there would be anything there. So we set out to analyze data across company sizes, across long periods of time, across industries to see are there some characteristics and traits of CEOs that are more likely to lead to success. And that's where we found that actually a lot of things that boards tend to get swayed by actually don't matter. The other shocking finding actually is we ran a lot of analytics. So we took a lot of data from our assessments conducted over decades and looked at different variables. And we looked at, one of the analysis we did is we looked at what predicts somebody's likelihood of getting hired as a CEO. And we separately looked at what predicts their ability to succeed as a CEO. And the overlap between those two sets of data were exactly 1 point. So if we pause on that, that is essentially the reason for this being such a treacherous journey for many boards, right? Is that boards get seduced by a lot of factors. We looked at factors that statistically demonstrate that the boards get swayed by those factors, right? And it is things that you talked about. It's the pedigree, right? Somebody with a great pedigree always looks more attractive. It's charisma and extroversion, likability, all of these factors. None of them had anything to do with performance. So when we looked at what actually leads to performance, there were 4 behaviors that stood out. We were hoping for 3 because 3 are easier to remember, but the data told us 4. So we had to stick to the data. And so we call it the DARE model of CEO, the DARE CEO genome behaviors. D stands for decisiveness. A stands for adaptability. R stands for reliability. And E stands for engage for results. And I can talk a little bit more about each of them. But first, just for fun, for your listeners. So of these 4, remember how I mentioned there was only 1 point of overlap between what gets you hired and what gets you results in the CEO role. So of these 4 DARE behaviors, which one do you think showed up on both sides?
Decisiveness.
It was actually reliability.
Reliability, gosh.
It was reliability. And, it was really interesting. So we were really annoyed at reliability. So first of all, if you look at these 4 DARE behaviors, right? What's not there? Where's the strategic vision? Where's the inspiration? Where's all this highfalutin stuff that we always expect from the CEO? Where's integrity and hard work? Typically, when we show up and work with a new board or with a new CEO, they already have their laundry list of criteria, right? And I'll tell you that most of them kind of sound roughly the same, even though the companies they run and what they need may be really different, right? And so what we uncovered with the data is that a lot of things that we imagine don't really show up in the data, but these 4 behaviors had a strong statistical power in being associated with high performance in the CEO role. And reliability showed up as a factor that both it doubled the chances of you being hired, and it increased your chances of success in the CEO role by about 12 times. And so reliability is very powerful. There are a couple of pieces to that, right? One is the mindset of reliability, and it is what kind of a universal quality that we look for in anyone we want to trust and rely on, right? It's do what you say, what you do. The CEOs that stand out for reliability, it's fascinating. You could see it in their early years. There was one CEO I was assessing, And he was talking about how he lived on a farm in California. And at age 16, his parents were gone and a fire started. It was one of these big California fires. And the kid is 16. He was 16 years old at the time. So I said, what'd you do? He's like, well, I got the chickens into the truck. I released the horses so they could run away on their own. I did all these things. Then I got into the truck. I drove 200 miles. I called the insurance company while I was driving. And then I called my parents and told them that our farm's probably gone, but I'm okay. And so what stands out in these highly reliable CEOs is that they're not just willing to be accountable or not willing to be relied upon. They always have this thirst. Like when all hell breaks loose around them, these are the people that actually want to be counted upon. And they want to make sure that the outcomes are good, not just for them, but everyone that depends on them. And so that's kind of the mindset of personal reliability, which a lot of CEOs have. Then the other piece is, how do you build a reliable organization? How do you build the practices, processes, and teams that deliver reliable performance? The most fascinating piece around reliability is typically founders and entrepreneurs, because they're often highly reliable individually and awful at building reliable organizations around them, because they tend to build organizations that rely on them, as opposed to organizations that can actually function in a reliable fashion with or without them. And, founder succession could be its own, and, some topic and very complicated. But so that's just one example with reliability of how you kind of peel the onion and you look at what does great actually look like? And what we find actually a lot of our clients, when we first released the book, The CEO Next Door, and started talking publicly about this framework of the CEO genome and CEO genome DR behaviors, initially we were really focused on CEO succession. And then all of our clients said to us, well, look, if ultimately we will be selecting for these factors, we're going to use it for all of our C-suite hiring, for all of our development of our leadership pipeline for the C-suite. And then we got a lot of feedback from the audience of basically people saying, well, I'm going to live my life by these 4 DARE behaviors because, if it's good enough for a CEO, it's going to be good enough for me. And so we actually have a self-test, like a little self-assessment that anybody can take online and get a sense for kind of how they stack up on each of these behaviors and get a few recommendations on how to get better. And I think we've had at this point over 20,000 people. We don't promote it in any way, but a lot of people have taken it and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from their takeaways. So DARE behaviors is what every board should look for, because those irrespective. And so typically when we do succession work, we'll design a scorecard that's really tailored for the company, and we'll measure every CEO candidate on these 4 DARE behaviors. And so that gives you a balance of what are kind of the CEO universal intrinsics that we're looking for, and then what are some of the factors that are specific to the company.
The other element that you mentioned in the book was the value of a CEO having a board role. And we had a recent exchange in the New Role Plus community where we saw mixed data surface on the value of executives having independent board roles, with some pointing to the data that shows it distracts from the core day job, while others point to the benefits from the wider context it provides. Curious to hear how your thinking has evolved on this.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I would love to hear more. And I'll need to go and listen to that podcast to learn more as well. So first of all, boards hate their CEOs to be overboarded, right? So boards of companies don't like their CEOs distracted, and that's fair. I think there's no substitute for that as a preparation kind of training, if you will. So ideally, it would be great if you're advanced stage candidate. So if you're within a couple of years of succession, maybe even 4 years, having an opportunity to put your successors on boards externally is incredibly valuable, because it teaches them in a very different, in a way, lower pressure way outside of their home base where the stakes are so high. They get a very different vantage point on how the board operates in a way that they can't actually in their home business, right? It gives them a broader view. It exposes them to different leadership styles, because often internal successors, they might have spent most of their career in one place and they've only seen one way of being a CEO. And so I see that as an incredibly valuable experience. Now, can it be a distraction? I think one board, most companies allow one board often. It absolutely can be a distraction. The other piece that you want to be mindful of is what's the motivation behind joining a board, right? What you don't want is if you don't want this as an ego play, it really needs to be a learning experience. And then you really need to be quite surgical around choosing the right board for them to be on, because it's not about status. It's not about this, glory of being on a board, and being really clear around, for example, you know, at the moment, right, a lot of the executives that are in their 50s might have had, you know, moderate experience of digital experience, but maybe not a moderate amount of digital experience, but not outstanding amount. And a lot of the company's fates and fortunes are really impacted by technology, right? And so having an opportunity to be on a technology board or on the board of a company that's really tech forward could be a tremendous learning experience for somebody, right? Or for a candidate that's maybe hasn't had as much international experience to get on a board that's a global board where they're adding a lot of value in a different way. And so I think that it needs to be really thoughtful. On the point of bandwidth, I think if done well, I mean, look, an executive who will be CEO ready needs to have wide bandwidth regardless. And so I think maybe they don't take committee ownership, committee leadership roles. So there are other ways to kind of box it in. But I do think that on the right board experience could be really valuable.
Listening to you there, that sounds, when you say it's important to understand their motivation for taking on the position and also the nature of the role itself, that sounds more of an opinion. Is there any data that you've gathered on that, or is that just your intuition?
It's empirical. Yeah, it's kind of the data is just my experience advising clients. No numbers behind it just yet.
Not yet. Well, look forward to that coming out. Once you've got a CEO in place, you've talked about the fact that improvements can be made. Dr. Thomas Chimera-Primozic observed that it's easier to predict the success of an individual than it is to know how they will respond to training and investment in learning and development. How would you advise a board member assessing a CEO to work out whether or not it's worth investing in that CEO and helping them develop along that DARE framework versus actually this is someone who's not going to make the cut?
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a really good question. I mean, first of all, 80% of the value of development comes from on-the-job development, right? So a lot of times, when we engage to support in grooming, coaching, and development of CEO candidates, the first thing company will grab on is, can you please coach him? Can you coach him or her? Can you coach them to make them more CEO ready? And what we'll typically say is, first of all, we're going to assess them and we'll tell you if actually coaching is the number one lever to success here. Because coaching is a lovely thing and it can be really effective. But if really what they need is an international assignment or a turnaround job, we need to take care of that first, right? So we had a situation where a very high profile company, an executive that was a lead candidate, hasn't had enough M&A experience. And at that very same time, the company was going through a transformative acquisition, but the CEO was reluctant to put the heir apparent in the role to lead the acquisition because they felt the CFO had more experience. And that's a perfect example of a great role for a board, right? Because that's the moment when the board can say, well, ultimately in a couple of years, you think you will entrust the fate of the whole business to this person's hands. Wouldn't you want them to actually have a hand in shaping how that business looks now? And wouldn't you want to test them in this M&A context? Because no amount of coaching on M&A will substitute for this individual actually being on the line. Right now, you could support them. You, of course, will make sure that the corp dev executives and the CFO are all over them and making sure that they're getting all the great support. So my first point on development is that 80% of that will happen on the job. And a great role a board can play, which is really valuable, actually. And we often will have that dialogue where we'll present assessment results, and we'll talk about here are the kinds of experiences this individual would most benefit from. And it could be different. It could be either content related, like whether it's M&A, international technology, or it could be the nature of the experience, or we could say, well, look, they've succeeded their entire career in situations where you could analytically arrive at the right answer. They need to be thrown off the deep end running this industry group where they're going to have to influence without authority. It's a highly charged political environment. And so we'll help them craft the right on-the-job experiences, because then it will be very obvious, have they learned or not? Have they delivered results in that environment, and how? Because the other piece you have to guard against is when the company kind of over curates and over protects the heir apparent and kind of paves a, golden pebble path to the top for them. Whereas really that's your moment to test them, because they surely will be tested when they get the brass ring, right? Then what you want to make sure is that they have the right boss, supporting them in the right way, that they have the right team under them so that they can stretch in the right way. Because if they're always micromanaging and zipping down, they're probably not stretching to develop their skills. And then coaching becomes a great glue around all of that to accelerate their learning. But it's very rare that's a substitute for a lot of these other moves.
Elena, time is flying. Before we go on to the lightning round, I want to just pick your brains on one last thing, which is around this concept of stealth CEO factories, which I loved as an idea.
Of all my favorite topics.
These organizations who are consistently producing great CEOs. I'm just wondering if there's anything that board members listening now can learn from your study of those organizations when thinking about building their own talent pipelines.
The first thing that talent forward boards are doing now that they weren't doing just even a few years ago is they understand that starting to focus on the CEO bench when you start talking about succession is too late. And so the boards, the talent forward boards have really raised their game and kind of encourage the CEOs and CHROs to raise their game on really looking at the full pipeline for talent. Ambitious CEOs, aspiring CEOs want to shape the talent pipeline for a decade out, not just their next kind of successors. The first thing is the quality of dialogue in the boardroom has improved around the full talent bench, having much more robust, objective assessment, understanding of their development needs, and ongoing dialogue around what are some of the bold moves, bold bets that can be taken to really, there's this concept of kind of lifetime value of a customer, right? We should be really mindful of the concept of lifetime value of a leader in that when you look at the pipeline early enough with like, say, a 10-year horizon, you have a lot more ability to really maximize somebody's potential. Because by the time they're in the C-suite, the number of rotations that you can do with them is really limited. So the number one is that I think it is an opportunity for the board to have a really productive partnership with the CEO and partner on that together. That's one. Number two is, and you'll see in that Harvard Business Review article on the stealth CEO factories, we've identified some common characteristics of companies that produce successful CEOs. And they tend to be that they have real opportunity for executives early in their career to have full scope of authority.
P&L ownership.
A real ownership with not a lot of suspenders. So there's another, in every company, there will be kind of these catapult roles. For example, in one business, we noticed that international posting is a gold mine because that's where they're out of sight, out of mind. They don't get a lot of supervision from corporate. And as a result, they're able to really grow as leaders. And that company actually, and we do a lot of work now, and companies have talked about critical roles for a long time. They tend to talk about critical roles vis-a-vis business and strategy. Companies need to start looking at these catapult roles and proactively identifying them for the value that they bring to development of their leaders. And so an example in this company, we uncovered that the international role was such a huge catapult role for them, but their appointments to that role had nothing to do with who had the highest potential. They were kind of putting people that were willing to take an international posting or someone who was a national. And so by analyzing that and uncovering that opportunity, they completely changed who they were putting into those roles. The CEO basically said, from now on, the only people that will get those postings in those robust P&L roles will be people that we really see being part of our future. And so it's basically taking a really analytical, fact-based view on who has potential, which you and I could do a whole entire podcast because billions of dollars are spent on identifying potential and most of them are wrong. Every company has succession lists for every role, but actually when the job comes up, very often the person is not pulled off the succession plan because these plans are pulled together like overnight for a board presentation, right? And so we've actually designed a set of analytical tools that have been shown to be able to identify potential early. And then the other piece is making sure that they're placed in roles that allow them to really blossom and grow as leaders.
Elena, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a quick question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Sounds good.
Best book every board member should read and why?
MIT professor Hal Gregerson. I don't know if you've seen his book. And the book is called Questions Are the Answer. So if there's one thing that every board member can do better is asking the right questions at the right time and the right way. And this entire book and his entire practice is all about asking questions. I love it. I actually think every CEO should read the book as well. I think all of us, the more senior we become, we tend to make a lot of statements. And I think there could be an incredible power unleashed through asking the right questions. So that's a big favorite.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Go along to get along.
Favorite quote?
I would probably go to Mark Twain for the favorite quote. It ain't what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you think you know that just ain't so. And I think that's the quote that every board member should paste on their laptop, particularly when they talk about CEO succession.
Most significant professional insight?
I would say it's the CEO genome.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
When I was leaving McKinsey, most people advised me not to go to ghSMART because literally the quote was, "You're a high performer. Why would you go and focus on people? Like, you could do anything. You could run a company." So it's turned out to be an amazing journey. I'm really grateful for it.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
Yeah, so I used to think that if boards were ineffective, it was because they had the wrong people. I think the travesty of boards is that they have amazing people that are performing woefully, like way below some of the parts. And I think that's why some of these like simple rituals, how the boards work together, the questions they ask, I think are just really essential.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
You know what I learned? What I learned is that as an advisor, I've been an advisor my whole career, first at McKinsey, now at ghSMART. You really focused on making sure that you're credible and trustworthy as an advisor to kind of earn the right to be in the room where it happens and to be advising on the high stakes decisions. The challenge is that you're kind of at the mercy of your clients in terms of ultimate outcomes. And I think a judgment call I fairly recently in the last few years got wrong is miscalculating a particular board's ability to navigate the board dynamics to put them in the best position to make the right decision. And I think in hindsight, I probably could have done a better job. We as a team could have done a better job supporting the board to kind of arm them maybe with better tools so that when the time came for a decision, they would have been able to be in a better position to take advantage of all the data they had.
Elena, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you for inviting me. This is really fun. And I look forward to listening to a lot more of your podcasts and just really wish you all the best.